Historical paintings, they don't always make sense.
Hello, guys, and welcome back to What Does That Painting Mean podcast. Today, we're going to be looking over paintings regarding Canadian slavery and how they relate and explain slavery. So, today, we're going to be looking at French kings, British kings, an Indigenous general in Canada and what he had to do with slavery, and finally, someone in Canada who led the way to the abolition of slavery. And we're going to discuss what they did with slavery in Canada, how it affected Canada and slavery, and we're going to also look at the importance and significance of it in Canada. So the first painting we're going to be looking at is the painting of Louis XIV. So Louis XIV was a French king, and he was in power when France had control of Canada as a colony known as New France. And the Louis XIV actually, he was the one who legally recognized slavery and allowed for slavery to come into Canada, with Africans and Indigenous people being enslaved. He also legally recognized and supported slavery in Canada because he believed that it would help the economy of New France and help it grow as a nation. Another thing that's very significant in slavery in Canada is King Louis established the Code Noir, which was essentially the slave code that was enforced upon the slaves, and it was very prejudiced and oppressive, and it attacked the slaves directly, affecting their rights, how they lived, and forcing them to be the property of their slave owners, and not recognizing them as citizens, which is very important because it shows the oppressive nature of the King Louis regime. So King Louis is actually remembered as the person who enabled slavery in Canada and forever damaged the country's history by allowing slavery to happen in a country that is now seen as one of the most free in the world. And the second painting we're going to be talking about today is a painting of King George III. And King George III was actually a British king who came into power after Britain won the 7 Years' War against France. And he actually, this was many years later, but he actually signed the Abolition of Slave Trade Act, which essentially any enslaved African or Indigenous person imported to Canada would actually not be a slave anymore. So the slave trade importation to Canada was essentially destroyed. And this led to the gradual decline in slavery in Canada and eventually to the full abolition about 30 years later. This to me, King George actually himself was against slavery, against abolishing slavery, which obviously he benefited a lot from the slave trade and the slaves in Canada, but it also shows that his legacy in Canada is actually not terrible compared to other slaveholding leaders, because he actually started the abolition and laid the groundwork for slavery leaving Canada for good and becoming the free nation it is known as today. And it also allowed for the Canada to be known as a safe haven to black escaping slaves from the South and the United States, because once they got over the Canadian border, they would not be extradited back because of the new laws that forbid that. And now they'd be all free and able to live. And this also connects to one of the other later paintings and how she was able to influence the abolition of slavery. So King George's Act was the first major step in abolishing slavery in Canada. So I think even with all the bad he did with owning slaves himself and being against the abolition of slavery, he at least did some good with that act, which led to what Canada is known as today. So the third person we're going to be talking about today is King William IV, who's actually related to King George III. And this is about 30 years after the King George's Act to abolish the importation of slaves into Canada. And King William actually had the Slavery Abolition Act in Canada, with slavery ending in Upper Canada, as in like Ontario, Lower Canada, Quebec, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. And although like slavery was already declining, this marked the official end to slavery in Canada, continuing it to be like a safe haven. And unfortunately, the slave owners had to be like compensated for their slaves, because the slaves were technically like their property. So they like got like they were able to like get reimbursed, which sucks, but you know, it was the step in the right direction. And under William IV, the rise of the Underground Railroad to help like escape slaves from the southern United States colonies was key, with it being a safe haven now that slavery is fully done. So it strengthened King William IV, although he did not also believe in the abolition of slavery. It helped shape British soil as like free soil for Black people, and it allowed them to like grow now since slavery is gone. So although like King William was also not like the best guy, he also helped lay the groundwork for what Canada is known for today as the free nation, with him fully abolishing slavery. And I think that's actually probably one of the best things that he could have done, considering like what his views were and like his actions were, and the influence of the British colony at the time. And the fourth painting I'm going to be talking about today is a painting of Joseph Brant, who was actually a Mohawk military leader and a political leader. So you might be thinking, what did Joseph Brant have to do with slavery? Well, he actually owned slaves of his own, enslaving some Black men, women, and children. This to me was kind of like shocking to learn about, because I wouldn't like think that like an indigenous leader would also be a part of the like slavery and like owning slaves. But actually Brant was like, he was advocated for the rights of Black loyalists, which kind of like contradicts like having slaves. But you know, it's interesting to see how like someone could own like slaves but also like want them to have like their own freedom. And Brant was normally like the middleman in slave transactions, facilitating trades, transfers, and sales. So he wasn't like fully involved like how like the British were, but he was still involved in like the atrocities of it. This to me, like, it's odd to me, because like it's very significant that he was like advocating for Black loyalist rights, but he was also having slaves. So like it's oxymoronic how that works. So like his lasting legacy in Canada, it's very mixed, because like obviously he owned slaves, but he also like advocated for the freedom of Black loyalists. So I guess like overall he could have been worse, but like he's not a very great person overall. And the fifth person we're going to be talking about today is Chloe Cooley, and it's obvious like the impact she had on slavery, with her fighting her captors and her master to fight for freedom, to scream, to alert like witnesses around what was happening to her, with them trying to sell her back to America. And this was a key factor in like the full Abolition of Slavery Act, with John Graves Simcoe being the one who like brought the act up. Then it was eventually like signed to like the No More Importation of Slaves and like the extradition treaty, which is like very important and key to Canada's history, because as it continues to solidify Canada as a safe haven for black slaves escaping the South, because they're not gonna like give them back to the Americans because it'd be against the law in Canada. So this to me, Chloe Cooley's legacy is obviously like astronomical in Canada and like regarding slavery as a whole, because they jump started like the abolition of slavery and full emancipation of slavery in Canada, which I think was like it needed to happen because like it's inhumane. And Chloe Cooley's significance, it's like almost too much to be put into words what she did for like black people in slavery in Canada. Because without her, like obviously the abolition would happen, but I don't think it would have happened as fast without Chloe Cooley's resistance and fight for freedom against her master before being put on the boat. And finally, I would just like to say that all of these paintings have like a massive impact on Canadian history and slavery in Canada, with them all having a certain significance, from owning slaves to abolishing slaves to introducing slaves to Canada and eventually leading Canada to like becoming a slave-free colony slash country. And without all of them, Canada wouldn't be what it is today, through the good and the bad and the ugly. But that's our history, and all these paintings show that. And that's all for today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Historical paintings, now they make a little more sense.